Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Mladen Juracek.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Balint Varkuti, and he is a co-founder and CEO at CereGate, which has been in stealth mode for the last 4 years, and they have built a software solution to encode and transmit information directly into the human brain. So they're not necessarily building a device, but they're building the software to read that device, and they're going to be selling it to companies. Anyway, Balint, do you want to welcome to the show, and do you want to introduce yourself better than I just did?
Thank you very much, Mladen. Yeah, this hits it pretty much on the head. So we went out in 2019 and started with analyzing the market, really. So basically seeing what is out there, and we saw that there's really phenomenal work being done in BCI companies. So we thought that's probably not really the area where we can add a lot, because there are already phenomenal things going on the hardware side and also on the DBS closed loop side, or SCS actually. And we saw that on the computer brain interface side, so not BCI, but rather CBI, the area of sending information, specifically in the idea of a general purpose interface, that really wasn't on the table. There are devices that do single modality type of transmission, such as, for example, Second Sight used to do for blindness or visual impairment, or cochlear implant companies do for hearing impairment. But there was really no one working on something where we could have a general system where we could transmit information for various types of clinical indications. So we thought that would be a really interesting idea to get into. And my background is actually, I came from psychology over neuroscience into the industry, and I worked in the functional neurosurgery domain for quite some time. And so I was aware that deep brain stimulation systems and spinal cord stimulation systems really have a fantastic track record in terms of safety. So we have decades of excellent safety data that we can build on. So we decided that actually it would be a good idea not to build our own hardware, which costs tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and easily takes up to a decade to actually get into market. But we thought if we build a software that can actually accomplish this task, then we can utilize implants that are already being implanted in more than 1,000 clinics worldwide, and we can have an accelerated path to market. And that's really the mission with which we set out in 2019 and started doing our work.
That's really interesting. I think it's very, informed or very wise to be like, okay, other people are already making the electrodes and we'll let them do that and we'll focus on the specialty of the software. So do you want to talk about this a little bit? Obviously, software is very difficult to get across an audio only format, but I guess what's the secret sauce? How is it possible, or what's special about it that hasn't already been done?
Yeah, in a certain sense, we have looked into this domain and seen that certain sensory phenomena have been around in brain stimulation for a very long time. So paresthesias, for example, false positive sensations where you have an unwanted feeling of a somatosensory nature, or phosphenes in the visual domain, or auditory hallucinations in the hearing domain. So we knew that through brain stimulation, we sometimes are caught in this wire, so to speak, and trigger something that the patient can perceive, but what in the clinical domain is unwanted. So for the past 30 years, we've been doing everything in programming to avoid these unwanted side effects. But what we discovered is that there's a whole universe of stability and reliability and reproducibility in these domains. So from the locations where the implant, which is off the shelf, is implanted in a classical surgical trajectory, so you don't have to change anything about the safety profile and the experience for the patient as far as the surgery is concerned. From there, we can actually tap into the rich fiber systems that are in the neighborhood of classical clinical targets. So if you think of the thalamus, then obviously there is a bunch of axonal fiber pathways passing there. The subthalamic nucleus is also in, you could almost call it a wire box of different types of afferent and efferent connections. So in other words, if you know how to shape the field of stimulation, if you know how to structure the signal, then even besides classical therapeutic tonic brain stimulation, you can tap into these systems and create something that the patients can consciously perceive. And the tricky thing is you don't want it to be uncomfortable. So imagine if we were encoding letters and A would be a bright flash in your eye and B would be a loud beeping tone. That would probably work on paper, but it would be a really horrible interface. You would be sitting in your car and driving it against the wall if you get these types of stimulations. So the art is staying really with perceptions that are not uncomfortable, that are easy to perceive, that are easy to understand, and that are stable at the same time. And so we have found out through doing these types of experiments in the past 4 years with more than 50 patients up to now, how basically to do this. We put a lot of this data into a database. We utilize machine learning and other types of approaches in order to have predictive models that can actually tell us, well, what type of interface shape, what type of personalized interface is best suited for the individual patient that we see in front of us. And here we really, I want to say, partner with the brain. So other approaches where you almost directly try to emulate writing natural neural code, which I think no company on this planet does today. We basically take a different approach. We partner with the brain in the sense that the brain is a fantastic signal decomposer. That's what it does. In a newborn baby, the brain also has pre-wiring, but still it has to process the stream of sensory information for the first time, get good at it, tell apart shapes, etc. So the brain is really naturally wired for pattern perception, for learning. And that's really what we do. So we send signals that the brain very quickly can pick up. It picks them up as behaviorally beneficial. So there's information in them that it can use and need in order, for example, to improve movement or to improve other types of symptoms that we might be desiring to treat. And that is really the approach. So on the one hand, intelligent shaping of the waveforms and stimulation patterns that work from these implants. And on the other hand, a clinical paradigm that really works with the patient and where the patients very quickly, literally in a matter of minutes, can utilize these inputs and gain skills or gain abilities that they probably have been missing, such as an artificial sense of balance to avoid falls, or even information that is akin to hearing for patients who probably are compromised with respect to their cochlea or cranial nerves and are probably not candidates for classical cochlear implant surgery.
Interesting. Yeah. Some of your guys' results are very impressive, how quickly they can pick it up. And you're absolutely right. The brain is very plastic, and which can be a benefit or a disadvantage depending on how you look at it. But yeah, so why thought putting in neural signals is very simple. You just blast it and you do something similar to whatever you hear. So I guess I'm still confused as what different things you guys are doing. Did I understand it correctly that you're doing almost like current steering and maybe different waveforms and doing, I guess, like superposition, combining the electric fields in different places? What exactly is different that, I don't know, a normal company, normal person off the street or normal neuroscientist off the street couldn't do themselves?
Yes. If you look at how the implants are developing, then you see that the implants are gaining more and more electrical contacts. So if you look at the early DBN stimulation electrodes, they had 4 contacts to begin with, or the very earliest ones probably even had 1. So if you look then how it developed, we gained directionality as a feature. We gain now more and more contacts, up to 8 or 16 contacts in implanted systems. And if you look at spinal cord stimulation, that's really where the trend is usually predictive. So you see these systems coming from there, and then after a while, these systems with this number of contacts also in the brain. But if you look at how these systems are programmed, then 80-90% of patients with Parkinson's disease, for example, who have these types of implants are only stimulated via a single or probably 2 contacts per hemisphere. So in other words, you have a whole bunch of unused electrical contacts that are implanted already and that do nothing literally in these patients. So one of the interesting things was to discover we can actually use these therapeutically untapped contacts. We can utilize them to deliver new types of waveforms. And exactly as you say, we can shape the field so that it doesn't interfere with therapy, but at the same time taps into the right efferent axons. So if you think of CBI as a general idea, cortical implants that, for example, want to provide artificial sensation in the hand would need to cover the S1, the somatotopic representation area of the hand area, for example, or these types of areas where hand functions might be located. But that requires a craniotomy. So you have to open up the skull. You have to cover basically all of that cortical real estate, in quotation marks, that you want to stimulate. But if you can tap into the right fibers, into the right axons that actually lead up information into the cortex, you can do this much more efficiently. So suddenly you can, from a smaller spatial volume, send information, and you don't have to cover the entire cortical surface with such an aggressive surgical procedure and achieve the same result or probably even better results this way. So I think one aspect is really this realization: how could we utilize the surgical reality that these patients have in a much more intelligent way? And how can we, without changing the risk profile for them, deliver these additional solutions? That is one aspect. And then the other is the real secret sauce in field shaping and waveform shaping. That's deep in the vault, so I cannot reveal all of that, obviously. But there's some interesting realizations as to how create a stable signal that is perceptible both intracranially, so from fibers that are really at the end of the thalamocortical loop or below the thalamus, as well as systems in the spinal cord. So a lot of our work is currently actually in the spinal cord stimulation domain, where we use dorsal column fibers in order to achieve this. And they have a completely different latency, have a completely different time domain profile, allowing us actually to do even higher transmission rates than through intracranial implants such as deep brain stimulation systems.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think it makes things obviously much more complicated, especially if you have something like a 16 electrode implant and then you're doing beam shaping or like current shaping and everything like this, then that it's an order of magnitude more complicated now. I think you would need computers and software and maybe like a machine learning adaptive system to be able to control this and really optimize it. So you're probably dealing with machine learning, artificial intelligence, adapting like this. But then the brain is plastic, so the brain is adapting at the same time. How does that work? And you're having these two systems fighting and one trying to be more plastic than the other. How does that work?
Oh, fortunately, they're not really fighting. It's rather reaching out to each other and shaking hands type of deal. But so you have processes that are on the neural signal shaping level. So for example, how do we create something that is not simply pushed away by the brain as noise, or that is not encountered by the brain's own compensatory mechanisms that are in place in order, for example, to stop the propagation of seizures or other safety mechanisms that are simply inherent to how the brain signals information. So on the one hand, you have to figure out how to do this in a way that is where the intervention is not harming any of the normal functions. On the other hand, the brain understands, for example, in the artificial sense of balance case, very quickly, okay, this impulse means I am leaning too far to the left. This impulse means I'm turning my head too far to the right. And from that point on, it really becomes more of a skill and really becomes absolutely natural. So we can talk to the patients, we can ask them about their favorite football team, about what they had for breakfast, they can answer. So you do not need to exclusively be focused mentally, consciously on interpreting these signals. Rather, it becomes second nature. So the image that we love to talk about is really, we call this braille for the brain. As the braille writing for blind or visually impaired people, in the beginning, when you learn this, you run your finger over the braille writing, and it's a very conscious process. You have to say, okay, there's a dot, there's no dot. Just like when you were, for example, learning to drive a stick shift car, you have to be fully focused and understand what's happening. But as you get better, you do it automatically. And a skilled reader of braille runs their finger over the indentations, over the dots, and the message realizes in their mind. And that is really also the experience that the patients who utilize our system have. The information becomes very natural, it is not distracting, and they can act on it. And we use one of these systems in a study that we're currently running in the United States, for example, to alleviate freezing of gait symptoms. So patients who have Parkinson's disease, a deep brain stimulation system, and are suffering from freezing of gait can utilize this additional input to structure their gait movements and, for example, break out of such a suboptimal state. And they can do this very easily. It doesn't require long hours of training or months of physiotherapy or something like that. It is a very natural signal that they can use to pace and structure their movement and let themselves be guided to a certain extent by that. So that's just one example of many possible applications of what you can do with this technology.
Okay. Can you read Braille?
No, but we played around with it a little bit to just understand how encoding works. And it is a 6-bit encoder. You have 6 positions basically where a dot can be and cannot be. And so we used a lot of that information transfer theory, and Braille is one of the examples to calculate what is actually the maximum bit rate really of the transmission function that we utilize. How much information could we in theory transmit maximally? And that is not answering the question, how much information could the brain decode? That's obviously a different biologically limiting factor. But in terms of how we can vary fields, how we can vary the waveforms, with even standard electrodes as they're on the market today, the amount of information you can transmit is astronomical. So the question is really, what are useful use cases? What do patients really benefit from? What do they need most? And that's really where we then come into the areas of DBS and SCS, where we try to understand, okay, which of these patients, for example, could benefit from a balance system that helps them to avoid falls, or other types of systems that help with movement disorders such as ataxia or other even stimulation-induced side effects in cases.
Yeah, it's very promising. So you were saying that a lot of these patients, they would have to have months of physiotherapy, and that your system is much faster. How fast does a patient learn to use this? I saw some things that were like 15 seconds or something like this, and they learned how to use it,
Yes.
or what?
Yes, exactly. So if you compare this also with other types of implants or other types of systems that have been used with patients, this is a phenomenally quick training time, simply because it's incredibly intuitive. So the majority of patients that we have been working with are DBS or SCS patients. These are usually older patients. So I think the youngest who we had was in his 30s. So we have patients who are not gamers, right? So these are not people who, if we try to explain them, you're going to perceive now signals and we want you to move in this way, and then it's a little bit like an artificial horizon, and you lean this way, then they look at you and what are you trying to tell me? So this is from the problem, basically really not something that is intuitive to them. But then when we turn it on, then when the perceptions arrive and they correlate it with their behavior, they feel this additional layer of reality almost that is underneath their normal perceptual stream, then it becomes super intuitive. And I think you can imagine this easily. You have a metronome or you have a song on the radio and you have a rhythm that you can't shake. You have something that you probably want to move along with. I personally have never experienced it, but I imagine it to be like that. And they also describe it in a similar way, that once it clicks, once they understand what these perceptions are for, the brain does the rest. And I think also the brain moves it a little bit into the background because it's solved and now I can focus on other things. And you can also see that in their behavior. They become more chatty over the course of the experiments, and it just becomes really more natural to them to utilize these systems. And that was an absolute revelation for us. So when we really saw these cases for the first time, when we experienced this, we were really blown away how simple it is for the patients to tune in and utilize this. And that's also why we're so excited to scale this technology down. And that's why we're here, because now that we have developed this paradigm and de-risked it from a technological, and I think also to a certain extent from a clinical perspective, now is going to be the really interesting time period where we partner with certain companies on the hardware side, on the prosthetic side, and bring these solutions really to market. And that's what's interesting to us. So not building a moonshot project that takes 10, 20 years, who knows what will be by then, but having time to market times of 2 to 4 years, because we can rely on absolutely approved technologies where there's no questions by the regulatory authority that this is something that is actually safe to apply. Our parameters also stay within the safety envelopes that are approved. So that means we don't use crazy frequencies or pulse widths or amplitudes that could be harmful to the patient, but we can rely on 30 years of experience with brain stimulation in order to shape these waveforms to be safe and reliable.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And yeah, finding this intuitive method, almost plugging in very quickly on almost like a port. I'm almost thinking like a USB port that is ready to receive something, and it was just sitting there the whole time. Yeah, so I want to talk about your business model. You're a business-to-business company, so you're actually selling your services or your software to other electrode companies or the actual implantation companies. I guess what's the justification behind this? You talked about it a little bit, but how does it work? What do you ask of that company that you're selling to? Is it like a licensing fee, or is it a percentage thing? Or you don't have to tell anything that you don't want to, any company secrets, but how does it work? How can a company work with you?
Yes, the business model is B2B. We are essentially a deep tech company. And what we're going for is similarly, like you had in some instances, you had Intel inside or some other brand inside. Similarly, we have CereGate inside in some products. And the business model, basically how we do this, is absolutely a case-by-case thing. It can be a license fee. It can be really anything. That depends mostly on the preferences in terms of P&L and business development and general market situation of the other side. We are very flexible. And in that sense, in some cases, we execute the clinical studies to approval ourselves. This is currently what we're doing for our daughter company in the United States. In other cases, we hand over the technology almost like a patent and license and IP package with some preliminary data, and then the partner takes it from there, and we have sold that specific use case or that specific solution then in that sense. And this really lives and dies with the market wins of the neurotechnology market. So we started at a time where both DBS and SCS were growing at double-digit annual growth rates, where you saw the Elon Musk Neuralink company coming onto the playing field, and everybody started talking about it. So we experienced a lot of support simply because the market started to realize, oh, in BCI and the neurotechnology, there's really something interesting going on. And that helped us a lot because there was a lot of fantasy all of a sudden and imagination around where this all could go. And this is a really interesting period then to see where's the market going to go now? Where is it going to develop now? We're going to see soon the first BCI companies get approval. We're going to see the first hardware actually be on the market and help patients and realize all of this potential. And then differentiation is going to become an even more important aspect. And this is really where we can help. We have something that probably no one else can offer in this version today. And that is going to be really interesting for us in the coming years to see how are we going to bring this potential into both the neuromodulation as well as into the BCI markets.
Yeah, that's exciting stuff. And it seems like you guys are flexible and willing to work with everybody. So you've been in stealth mode for 4 years. And I guess maybe this is you coming out in public or something like this. I guess you've done some talks at conferences, but I'll consider this the inaugural event of the company. But what have you been up to, and why did it take 4 years? And then do you have some companies that you're already working with? Or do you have any success stories, I guess, so far?
Yeah. Why does it take 4 years? In medical device terms, this is light speed. In my own personal perception, it could have gone much faster if you ask me. But obviously this is something we had to weather COVID, which was not something that we really expected. So the whole clinical activity slowed down for 1 to 2 years and so on. So it was a little bit of a tricky process to get through the last ups and downs. But in this time, we went and ran a number of clinical trials in Europe and then started the trial in the US and really de-risked the technology. We have now a larger corpus of data from patients with DBS, patients with spinal cord stim. We developed our capabilities further also to include recording. So in the beginning, we were basically doing open loop transmission. Now we are doing more of a closed loop approach, where for the calibration, where we have this neural interface in order for the recipient to be able to receive information. So we developed this calibration approach now in a more closed loop fashion. So in spinal cord, for example, we record ECAPs in order to better understand how are we interfacing with the afferent system. In the brain, also, there are obviously target signals that we can be recording. So that was a big undertaking, actually, to do these types of things and then to execute these studies of the clinical partners. That kept us very busy in the last 4 years. And now we are running a fog lights trial for the treatment of freezing of gait in the United States. It's a currently recruiting trial that you can find on clinicaltrials.gov. So that is ongoing. That is really the apple of our eye. And we are very much looking forward to seeing first results from that trial. And we are preparing partnerships and other trials that I can unfortunately not talk about yet. But there are other things in the making, both in the spinal cord as well as in the CBI, BCI domain.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And like you said, 4 years can be both light speed and mind-numbingly slow. But I'm curious about this FDA approval, regulatory approval, because I guess I'm more used to devices, and you have to prove that it's safe, but this is just the software, so it's just changing an existing device and how it acts and keeping it within the operational limits that were already predefined. Seems like it might be easier to get something like this approved. Do you want to talk about the regulatory pathway and how to do a software versus a hardware solution?
Yeah, so we submitted submitted for FDA breakthrough process, I think, in the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, we got it granted. So that was a longer process where the FDA looked at the data that we had amassed to that point and concluded that specifically for freezing, there was no other solution probably that could offer this type of benefit. And then in the breakthrough program, you have a faster iteration. You have sprints where you are more interactive with the FDA and can present all the data, shape a study very interactively, and then commence that work. And that was absolutely essential to basically get to the point where we then can starting to enroll patients and can really bring this a little bit closer to availability for the patients. I think if you go the hardware route, as you're familiar, you have to show biocompatibility. You have to show that your device does probably what earlier predicate devices have been doing. The argumentation, electrons are electrons, this is just another can, but it does the same thing, is not followed in all jurisdictions. And sometimes you have situations where this is more readily accepted. For other domains, this is not so readily accepted. So in a software approach where you say we have an algorithm or we have a workflow, how we personalize the programming for the patient, the waveform looks like this. We know the waveform to be safe. We have sufficient safety data from earlier trials, and that is already sufficient to then say, okay, this is ready to prove both safety and efficacy in an ongoing trial. And that is much faster, as you can imagine, than amassing all this data for hardware. Also for hardware, because there are other breakage points, right? Does the lead break? Does the battery work? Do the programmers work? Is wireless connectivity a given? You have completely different enrollment numbers. You have to have hundreds of patients in order to get such a trial through, and you need many millions of dollars and many years in order to get there. So the software, and I want to call waveform development approach, is much more lean. It is from an investor perspective much more capital efficient. And for the patients, the huge benefit is that if it works on the device they already have, then the availability is not a question. You're not enrolling people and saying the next generation of patients might benefit from this. It's not going to be for you. It could be for the patients of this era, so to speak. They do not have to wait for a newly approved technological hardware solution that then also has to fight its way into a market that is heavily contended. So that's also the other factor that I think we saw also with Second Sight and other developments, that sometimes when then such a company ends or changes direction, what actually happens to the patients in the next iteration. So that is simply not a risk if you work with the right partners and basically there's no risk of these devices disappearing. Then this is something that also for the patients I think is a much better perspective to receive this therapy in the end.
Yeah, for sure. And then I guess from a business standpoint too, things are much more attractive. It's much more scalable, and theoretically it's already been built and you just have to distribute it. It's a little bit easier to make money. I want to talk about your background because I don't know if I've really talked to somebody who had done behavioral sciences, psychology, or kind of along these lines. And so I'm curious how that shaped your outlook on this, if you think it may be a contributing factor to this, and then what kind of effect your sword fighting, your fencing experience had as well.
Oh my God, where did you know that from? Yeah, so I think my background coming from psychology and these areas, I think that helped me be in contact with models of the mind that are simply different than if you only look at the brain as a system of cells, of electrical fields, of potassium channels, of that. So I think having this part of having a certain understanding of subjectivity, how do things work or why do they work for people, I think that is majorly important. And as in pain therapy, the fact that probably a pain patient can talk to a clinician or have contact with someone is a major modifying factor as to the success of the overall therapy. So in other words, the whole subjective experience plays an absolutely key role. Also, I got in contact with the literature on sensory substitution, which the works of Paul Bach-y-Rita in the 70s, and all of these things, these were, I think, majorly inspirational works for me to understand there are so many different things the brain can do. That's just really fascinating. But so after doing psychology for a while, I very quickly understood that this is not my forte. I would not be a good therapist or would not be probably a good psychologist. So then I went into neuroscience, studied a bit more of imaging. So I went through all of the imaging methods, did everything from fiber tractography, MRI, EEG, all of that, also BCI work. And that gave the tools to then, I think, really guess a little bit more accurately what could work and what couldn't work. And I think the career in industry then helped me have not only the right connections, but I think understand how that works, because that's a realization, whether we like it or not. a therapy can only be successful for the patients if it is being offered. If someone is bringing it into the hospitals and making it available and making it scalable and making it efficient. And that is absolutely very key. And I think that was, I think this mix gave me the ability to be a little bit of I don't want to say an expert, but I have a little bit of knowledge in different domains. And then I have a fantastic team, we have fantastic partners who bring in all the expert knowledge in neural interfacing, in statistics, in clinical, in regulatory, in the hardware background. And that's really then what accelerated us and gave us the ability to do all of these things. And I think the fencing is just being able to take a hit. I think that's the key skill you come away from if you fence for a while.
Yeah, I did it once, just like an intro session, and it was really interesting. I couldn't figure out how to actually get people, but that's pretty cool. And I mean, BCI is famously multidisciplinary. You need to have knowledge of lots of different fields, and it all needs to be integrated together. And a lot of people have this breadth of knowledge, but I would say maybe somehow the most, because you have done all those things that you had mentioned. So I think that's very interesting. Maybe it leads to the success of this a little bit. But I didn't hear anything about writing software or machine learning code or anything like this. Is this something that you were able to find, or is this a skill that you didn't need? Or can you talk about how you're starting basically a coding company, and it doesn't seem like you have a big background in coding?
I did a little bit. So during my PhD, I had to learn how to program painfully, and I did a stint in all kinds of languages, learned about neural interfaces and neural networks. So that was actually before the deep learning era, and that gave me a pretty good, I think, understanding in coding. But I stopped because I'm too messy for this, but I had a baseline understanding, and my career in industry was at a software company. So I saw how medical devices are being assembled, which are software. How do you do verification, validation? How do you do testing? How do you relink these products into the reality in order to build efficient tools for the clinicians? So I think that was the mix. But then in our current company, I haven't programmed a single line of code, and that is better for everybody involved.
Maybe safer too. Yeah, I feel the same way. I know what needs to be done theoretically, how to do it, but then better if somebody else does it. Also, you had sent a slide deck before going into this. I thought this was really nice and went over it. There, I counted, I think, 25 people involved in the company. And then on LinkedIn, it's showing 15 people. But as far as I know, you haven't made much money. Did you raise venture capital, or what was kind of your funding? And then why such a big team as well?
Yeah, so we had great partners, I think, from the venture capital space. We then also raised different rounds over time. The team grew actually quite rapidly in the last years. In the beginning, it was really just practically just the three of us. And then it really got a little bit bigger. The core team today is around, I think, 17 people, with a team in the United States and a team that is distributed here in Europe. We have been working in a hybrid fashion actually already before the pandemic. Some of our people sit in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Hungary, in Germany. So it's really from all over the place. And here we have different functions. We also have the great benefit of having a fantastic advisory board. So many people that you also saw on the slides are actually rather advisors who advise us on clinical or regulatory matters or business matters. And that is absolutely key. So having people who can be corrective, who can tell you sometimes whether you're going in the wrong direction, that's invaluable and was absolutely essential for the success of the company. And that's really also why we're now slowly emerging from stealth. On the one hand, we are looking at potential partners and talking at these different congresses with people who might be interested in our technology. On the other hand, we are also looking into some fundraising and recruiting. And I think the recruiting is the really key thing. It is now really a boom time. I think if you're interested in neurotechnology and neural interfaces, I think we have the real special feature that with us, you very quickly see with real patients, basically what the benefit of this technology can be. So you don't have a lead time of lab work or bench work of 10 years, but this is something where we very practically can help people. And this is really what motivated me always. So actually, I really came away from these other domains because I was always looking for something that really works, so to speak. And that's really also what drew me to functional neurosurgery, where it's not neurosurgery where you repair a structural problem or you remove a tumor or something, but actually you try to modify the function. Actually, you try to bring back quality of life. You don't do palliative surgery or these types of things, but you really bring back some quality of life and some years of life for these people. And that's incredibly motivating. And I think that's really the driving force of why we do what we do also at CereGate.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's a boon time. It's an exciting time to be a software person or programmer within the field of neurotechnology. And other companies like Blackfin and Rune Labs, who have been on the show, they're also doing good work in this and can have impact, I would argue, much faster than designing new devices or even doing the surgeries and stuff like this. These are, again, software solutions can be implemented instantaneously, and then you can see this.
So with hardware, you sometimes have simply the disadvantage that you are a little bit married to the time point when you started. So if you started a long time ago, you started with that technology and you have a whole regulatory documentation that's building on that. So pivoting completely, changing completely the ethics, the MEMS, all the basics is becoming more and more complicated the more years go by in a certain sense, or it is in that sense a bit more costly. So obviously pivots and developments and jumps are much more easy in a certain sense with software. Plus we are hardware agnostic. We are more than happy if there are newer generations of implants that have increased connectivity, increased processing power, increased linkages. That's fantastic. And that's really a benefit that you have with software, that you can pivot much more easily and go with the times in a certain sense differently than probably you can with hardware investments.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you started 4 years ago and you're coming out of stealth mode. What does the next 4 years look like? What's on your horizon?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be developing further therapies and solutions in the DBS space. We have been now working very much in the Parkinson's disease domain. And obviously there are others, tremor and other interesting indications where I think we can contribute meaningfully. We have a second pillar where we work in the spinal cord stimulation domain on new solutions for pain therapies. So here, intelligent interpretation of signals such as ECAPs and other recorded signals in combination with the calibrator software we have can really provide some interesting solutions to target pain therapies more clearly. And now with the change with Saluda and Medtronic and many other companies focusing more into this domain, that personalized sensing is going to be a real breakthrough. That is really paving the way for us to bring these types of solutions really to the next generation of platforms and devices. And lastly, and that's actually the biggest one, is the computer brain interface work, where we are now going to, in the next year or two, basically building the data for a new breakthrough application for these, I want to call it artificial sense of balance and other types of rehabilitative solutions. And that's going to be really interesting. So I think after building the right data with this, with the patients, we're going to then, with the suitable partner, I think, be in the market and be able to offer this type of solution to patients sometime around 2026, 2027. That would be my dream timeline. But obviously, fingers crossed that there are no other unforeseen black swan events in our way. But that is really the direction that we want to go into.
COVID squared.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is really exciting. Balint, I think this has been excellent, and I wish you lots of success in these plans and the next 4 years. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, I think we really covered everything. And thank you very much for this interview. Thank you for the invitation, Leighton. And the podcast is fantastic. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.